Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different from our usual diet of plague, famine and people dying in ditches. Tonight we're putting on something sleek, something cashmere, something that smells faintly of cigarette smoke, aged whiskey and a very expensive leather wallet. Tonight we're stepping into the world of the filthy rich in 1960s New York. And I do mean filthy, not in the medieval peasant way. No lice, no pottage, no mysterious rashes. I mean filthy as in obscenely, aggressively, embarrassingly wealthy. The kind of rich where your biggest daily problem is whether the caviar arrived cold enough and whether your penthouse has too many bedrooms or just too many. Before we dive in, I just want to say a genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You know who you are, and I hope you're listening from somewhere comfortable. Because this one was a joy to research. If you enjoy what I do here, please take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy it. No pressure. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is. These little windows into your world are one of my favourite parts of doing this. And if you'd rather listen on the go, we're now on Spotify, link is in the description. Now dim those lights, pull the covers up, maybe put on a fan, and make yourself genuinely comfortable. Because you've earned it. More than the people in tonight's story ever did, frankly. Now. Before we get into the silk sheets and the 3 martini lunches, let's ask a few questions. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be loaded in the 1960s? Did the truly rich ever worry about anything? Did they wake up anxious? Or did they wake up and immediately call someone to be anxious on their behalf? What did a penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side actually look like and smell like, and who cleaned it? And were they thanked? What did these people eat for breakfast? And was it even food, or was it more of a performance? Did they go to the office, or did the office come to them? Did their children like them? Did their spouses like them? Did they like themselves? Could you, a normal, sensible person who has experienced actual hardship, survive even a single afternoon in their world without either laughing, crying, or throwing a cocktail shaker at someone? Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1963 New York City. You have a closet the size of your current apartment, a driver waiting downstairs, and absolutely nothing to complain about. You will complain constantly. Welcome to the top. Your home is not an apartment, it is a statement. A full-floor penthouse on Park Avenue or Fifth Avenue, somewhere between the 60s and the 80s. Street numbers, that is, not years, though in many ways those blocks existed outside of time entirely. Floor-to-ceiling windows look out over Central Park like a painting hung specifically for you, and in a way, it was. The doorman knows your name. The elevator opens directly into your foyer. There is a foyer. There is art on the walls that was chosen not because anyone liked it, but because a man in a suit explained that it would appreciate. You have 14 rooms, and you use perhaps 4 of them. The rest exist to remind visitors, should they wander in the wrong direction, that you're the kind of person who has rooms you don't use. The ceilings are high. Not in the way of a nice modern apartment where the builder added a foot and called it a selling point. High in the way of a previous century, 10, 11 feet, with plaster mouldings that were installed by craftsmen whose names nobody recorded because nobody thought to. The floors are herringbone parquet, dark with age and polished weekly by someone who is not you. There are fireplaces. You use one of them occasionally in winter, mostly for atmosphere rather than heat, because the building has excellent central heating, and the fireplaces are largely symbolic at this point, monuments to a time when fire was necessary rather than decorative. You light them when there are guests, because guests respond to fireplaces the way people respond to being handed something warm. They relax, they expand, they feel taken care of, which is precisely the point. The living room is large enough to hold 30 people for cocktails without anyone feeling crowded, and it has held 30 people for cocktails on numerous occasions. The furniture is arranged with the kind of precision that looks accidental. A sofa here, 2 chairs pulled toward the fire, a low table that is just far enough from everything else to suggest it landed there naturally. It did not land there naturally. A decorator spent 2 afternoons moving it by increments and then declared it right. You were billed for those afternoons. You paid without looking at the number. There is a library, though calling it that is generous in terms of how often the books are consulted. The shelves are full, leather-bound sets of things, good things, things that signal a person of seriousness and taste, and on the desk there are papers that suggest purposeful activity. This room is where you make calls you don't want to make in front of other people. The children know not to come in when the door is closed. The housekeeper knows not to vacuum during certain hours. Everyone in this apartment has calibrated their behaviour around you without anyone having to explain why, which is perhaps the purest expression of the life you're living. Things arranged, without discussion, to suit your comfort. The kitchen is at the far end of the apartment, past the dining room, past the butler's pantry, past the small room where the silver is stored and polished and counted. You have been to the kitchen perhaps 11 times in the last year, mostly by accident. The cook manages it entirely. You know her name. You greet her at Christmas with an envelope. You could not tell you what the stove looks like, and at night, when the guests have gone and the glasses have been cleared and the apartment is quiet, you stand at the window in the dark and look out at the park below, the trees just visible, the lights of the buildings on the far side reflecting in the reservoir, and you feel something. It is not quite gratitude. It is not quite satisfaction. It is the particular private feeling of a person who has everything and has run out of things to want, which sounds like peace, but is, in practice, its own peculiar kind of discomfort. You turn away from the window. The apartment hums around you, expensive and still. You go to bed. Tomorrow the car will be waiting at 8:30. You don't wake up to an alarm clock. Alarm clocks are for people with jobs they didn't choose. You wake up when your body decides it is time, which is usually sometime between 8 and 10, depending on what happened the night before. A tray has already materialized on the bedside table, coffee, precisely the way you take it, delivered by someone who has memorized your preferences the way a scholar memorizes a text. Breakfast is not made in this apartment. It is assembled, arranged, and presented. There is a cook. There has always been a cook. Somewhere in the back of your mind is the vague awareness that food comes from somewhere, but the specifics stopped being your concern sometime around 1947. The coffee is the right temperature. This is not a coincidence. The woman who brings it has timed the walk from the kitchen and knows the difference between too hot, which is unpleasant, and cooled slightly, which is what you prefer, a distinction no one told her because no one had to. She has simply paid attention, which is the invisible skill that makes the whole apparatus run. You drink it in bed, against pillows that have been propped at the correct angle. The newspaper is on the tray. It has been pressed. You did not know newspapers could be pressed once. Now it would seem strange to hold one that wasn't. The bedroom itself is a room designed for one purpose, and that purpose is rest, which means it contains nothing that would remind you that the world outside exists and requires things from you. The curtains are heavy enough to hold back the morning until you are ready for it. The carpet absorbs sound the way water absorbs a dropped stone. There are fresh flowers on the dresser, small ones, low enough not to obstruct anything, changed on Tuesdays and Fridays. They are always the same flower because you once said you liked them, and that preference was recorded and has been honoured ever since, without further discussion. Getting dressed is a process, not a lengthy one, but a considered one. Your clothes are laid out, not all of them, but the ones appropriate for what the day requires, which the housekeeper knows because the appointment book is kept in the hall and is consulted each morning. You do not open a closet and stand in front of it wondering. The decision has been pre-made. All you have to do is put it on, which sounds simple and is the point. Your mornings contain no friction. Every small decision that might produce friction has been eliminated in advance by someone whose job is to eliminate it. By 9:30 you're dressed, or by 10:15 and you appear in the dining room or occasionally in the sitting room where things have been arranged for the day's beginning. There are letters on the desk, the social ones, the invitations and the thank you notes that require responses, and the secretary, who comes 3 mornings a week, will handle the rest. There are calls to be made, there are calls to be avoided. The distinction between these two categories is the primary cognitive task of the morning. Somewhere in the building, people are going to work. You can hear, distantly, the faint percussion of the city doing what cities do in the mornings, moving, rushing, the particular urgency of people who have places they must be at a specific time. You are aware of this. You feel something about it that isn't quite guilt and isn't quite relief, but lives somewhere in between. The low, comfortable hum of a life in which the morning belongs entirely to you, with its pressed newspaper and its perfect coffee and its flowers changed on Tuesdays and Fridays, and nothing that needs to be anywhere by 9. Behind every great fortune in 1960s, New York was a small army of people who made it possible to function as a human being. The cook, the housekeeper, the lady's maid, the driver, the doorman, the building super, the dry cleaning runner, the florist on retainer, each one essential, none of them especially visible unless something went wrong. And something was always going wrong. Just never anything the wealthy person themselves would hear about, because that's what the housekeeper was for. Managing the help was itself a kind of full-time occupation, particularly for the wives, who ran households of 5 to 12 staff members with the organisational rigour of a military campaign and the emotional labour of a therapist, while maintaining the social fiction that it all simply happened on its own. The housekeeper was the keystone. Without her, the whole arch collapsed. She arrived early before the household was awake, and she was still managing things after the household had gone to sleep. She knew where everything was. She knew what was running low in the linen closet and what needed to be sent to the silver polisher, and whether the good china had come back from the last dinner party in the correct number of pieces. She kept a mental inventory of the apartment that was more accurate and more detailed than anything written down anywhere, because it lived in her, and she was, in the truest sense, indispensable, a fact she knew, and which gave her a very specific, very quiet kind of power. The cook had her own domain, and defended it with the territorial certainty of someone who had been doing this longer than you had been eating. She negotiated with the market, managed the daily menus, accommodated dietary preferences that change without notice, and produced food that appeared on the table as though conjured. She was not to be crowded in the kitchen. She was not to be given suggestions by anyone who had not themselves ever stood over a stove for 8 consecutive hours. She tolerated the lady's maid, barely tolerated the housekeeper's morning instructions, and had an understanding with the driver that was never explained to anyone else. There were boundaries. The line between the family and the staff was maintained with care on both sides, not coldly, not unkindly, but with the clarity of people who understood their roles and the particular kind of stability that comes from everyone staying in them. First names were common in one direction. There were gifts at Christmas, always in envelopes, always without discussion of the amounts. There was loyalty, genuine and mutual, between families and staff who had been together for decades, the kind that persists across moves and illnesses and the quiet catastrophes that households quietly absorb. But it was not equal. It was not designed to be equal. And the people who worked in these apartments were there because domestic service in the 1960s was still a significant source of employment, particularly for immigrant women, Irish and Caribbean and Eastern European, women who had come to New York and found this world and navigated it with competence and discretion, and the constant private exercise of knowing when to be present and when to disappear. They were very good at disappearing. The wealthiest households ran on this talent almost entirely. What you, as the person whose name was on the lease, understood about any of this was partial at best. You knew the names, you knew the general outline of who did what. You had preferences. The good silver on Tuesdays meant polishing on Mondays. The flowers should never be lilies because of the smell, and those preferences were honoured without requiring you to understand the infrastructure beneath them. It was like living above a very well-run machine you had never seen the engine of. The lights came on, the meals appeared, the car was downstairs, and somewhere behind all of it, in the kitchen and the back rooms and the service elevator you'd perhaps never taken, the people who actually ran your life were running it, as they did every day, without fuss, without fanfare, and almost entirely without your awareness. Getting dressed in 1960s, New York high society was less a personal activity and more of a scheduled event with geopolitical implications. What you wore, where it was made, who made it, and whether you had it before anyone else, these were not aesthetic questions. They were statements of rank. A woman of serious social standing did not buy clothes off a rack. She had fittings. She had a relationship with a dressmaker, or better yet, a direct line to Paris, where the real decisions were being made by men who had never met her and never would. By the time her Balenciaga or her Givenchy arrived at the apartment, it had been fitted, refitted, adjusted, and delivered in tissue paper, inside a box that was itself more elegant than most people's furniture. The process began months before the clothes were needed. In January and July, the Paris collections were reviewed, through trusted sources, through Vogue, through the reports of women who had actually attended and who described what they saw with the careful precision of war correspondents. Decisions were made about what to commission, what to acquire, what to have copied by the dressmaker on the East 70s who could produce something almost indistinguishable from the original for a fraction of the price, and who you would never name publicly, because doing so would defeat the entire purpose. The fashion calendar was a real calendar. You planned around it the way other people planned around school semesters or tax deadlines. For the men, the calculus was different but no less precise. The suit came from the same tailor on Savile Row, or from his near equivalent in Midtown, and it was bespoke, not made to measure, which was a different thing, a lesser thing, a distinction that mattered in a way that was difficult to explain to anyone who hadn't grown up understanding it. The fabric was selected from bolts brought out for your consideration. The cut was discussed. The lining was chosen. You returned for fittings. The whole process took months and produced a garment that fit you, specifically you, and no one else, which was ultimately the point of all of it. A man in a bespoke suit from the right tailor looks a particular way, pulled together without effort, as though the clothes grew on him, as though any other configuration would simply be incorrect. Shoes were stored in cedar trees and polished weekly, whether they had been worn or not. Shirts were monogrammed on the cuffs and the breast pocket, with initials no larger than strictly necessary, because restraint in monogramming was itself a signal. Ties were silk, always. Cufflinks were inherited or appeared to be. The entire male wardrobe operated on the principle that nothing should look new, even when it was new, and nothing should call attention to itself, even when it was extraordinary. The woman's jewellery occupied its own category, parallel to the clothes but governed by its own etiquette. Certain pieces for daytime, different pieces for evening. Costume jewellery, good costume jewellery, was acceptable in the afternoon, on the street, at lunch. Real jewellery and real meant things of genuine and considerable value, belonged to evening, to the events where it would be seen in the right light by the right people and read correctly. Pearls were a foundation, always reliable. Diamonds required an occasion. Coloured. Stones, sapphires, rubies, emeralds in important settings were statements, and statements needed to be appropriate to the moment, or you risked looking as though you were trying too hard, which was the cardinal sin of the entire enterprise. Because all of this, the Givenchy, the bespoke suit, the monogrammed cuffs, the sapphires on the right occasion, was ultimately in service of a single, disciplined performance, looking as though it cost nothing and required no thought. The supreme achievement was effortlessness, and effortlessness, as anyone who practiced it knew, was the most exhausting thing in the world to maintain. There were two kinds of mornings in the life of the 1960s New York rich. There was the morning you stayed in, ate something restrained and elegant at the long dining table, while the newspaper was pressed and set at your elbow, and felt reasonably satisfied with your own discipline. And then there was the morning you went out, which was less about breakfast and more about being seen having breakfast at the Carlyle or the Pierre, or the right booth at the right coffee shop, where the eggs were fine but the proximity to other important people was the real nourishment. Either way, you were probably drinking something you shouldn't have been drinking at that hour. This was the 1960s. It was basically medically recommended. Breakfast at home was a formal affair, even on days when it was only the two of you. The dining table was set, not elaborately, not with the full ceremony of an evening, but with the baseline presentation that the household maintained as a matter of standard. Linen place mats, not paper, real silverware, not a drawer rummaged. Eggs were prepared to order in the kitchen and appeared at the table in a covered dish with a small formality that sounds unnecessary until you have experienced it, after which the alternative seems slovenly. There was toast in a rack, a silver toast rack, because a plate produced damp toast, and damp toast was a failure the cook took personally. There was fruit, arranged. There was something to read, positioned where it could be seen without requiring effort. The children, if they appeared, ate at a different time in a different room, managed by whoever was managing them that morning. Breakfast was not a family affair in the modern sense. No one in pyjamas, no one pouring cereal into a bowl balanced on a knee, no television in the background. Breakfast was composed. Breakfast was the first demonstration of the day that everything was in order. Going out for breakfast was a different kind of statement. The Carlyle on Madison Avenue had a dining room that operated at the particular frequency of old money, hushed, well lit without being bright, staffed by people who'd been there long enough to recognize faces and attach them to the correct level of attention. Being a regular somewhere like this meant being greeted by name at the door, being shown to your table before you'd indicated which one you wanted, and being understood to prefer your coffee in a certain way and your eggs at a certain doneness. It was the restaurant's personalised service environment, which was the version of the restaurant that serious money used. What you ordered was less important than how you were received. You could order the same eggs you had at home, and they would be almost as good, though the cook at home had more consistent results because she was cooking only for you. But the act of ordering them here in this room, acknowledged by this maître d', beside this particular cross-section of the city's serious people, accomplished something the kitchen couldn't. It placed you in the world. It confirmed that you occupied a position in it. It was public in a way that eating at home was not, and publicness, managed carefully and correctly, was its own form of nutrition. The bill, when it came, was handled quietly. Cash in a billfold, or a house account, or a wave of the hand that meant it would be taken care of, and it always was. You were not someone who counted change. You were not someone who paused at the total. You were someone who had the particular, deeply practiced ability to receive a check and respond to it without any visible thought whatsoever. This too was a skill. This too had been learned. And like all the other skills required at this level, it looked from the outside like it came naturally. Let's talk about lunch. Not the kind you eat at your desk while answering emails, which would have been considered a sign of failure so profound it might never recover from it. Lunch in the world of the 1960s New York elite was a 2 to 3 hour production held at one of a rotating roster of establishments: the Four Seasons, Le Pavillon, the Colony Club, 21, where the table you were given communicated your standing before you'd ordered a thing, and where the martinis arrived early and kept arriving, because that was simply how business was conducted. Deals were made, alliances were forged, enemies were tolerated with elaborate courtesy. And somewhere around the second martini, everyone loosened up just enough to say what they actually meant, which was then walked back by the third. The table assignment was not incidental. At Le Pavillon, the front room was power, and the back room was consequence. Being seated in the right room at the right table by the right person was a public event witnessed by everyone else in the restaurant who was also sitting at the right table, watching to see where you'd been put. The entire first few minutes of any important lunch were conducted under this observation. The greeting, the seating, the opening pleasantries, all of it happening simultaneously as a private conversation and as a performance for the room. If this sounds exhausting, it was. If it sounds like it required a certain kind of stamina that has nothing to do with alcohol, it absolutely did. The alcohol helped anyway. The martini in 1960s New York was not a drink so much as an institution. Gin, cold, very dry, with an olive or a twist depending on the man and the day. Some people had strong opinions about the ratio. Some people had strong opinions about the glass. A few iconoclasts ordered vodka, which was becoming fashionable, and which the gin loyalists regarded with a narrow-eyed tolerance that just barely concealed contempt. The first martini arrived quickly, before you had settled entirely, before the menus had been fully considered, because the rhythm of the lunch required it, required that the transition from street to table be softened, that the armour of the workday be loosened by degrees, that the 2 men or 3 men or 4 men across from each other be permitted to become, incrementally, more themselves. Business, when it was discussed obliquely. Nothing was proposed directly, at least not at the good tables at the serious restaurants. You circled, you established shared ground, you referenced mutual acquaintances and established that you were the kind of people who knew the right people, because knowing the right people was both the prerequisite for the conversation and the reassurance that what was being discussed would be handled correctly. Direct proposals came later, at the end perhaps, or in a follow-up call, or in a letter from the lawyer. The lunch was not where the deal was made. The lunch was where the decision was made that the deal could be made. Food was ordered and arrived and was eaten with the moderate attention of people for whom eating was not the point. The portions at these establishments were correct. Not large, never large, because large was not sophisticated, and the cooking was French in sensibility, and technically accomplished and really quite good, and on most days no one was paying it the attention it deserved, because they were either managing the conversation or calculating something private behind the social surface of their face. You left sometime between 2:30 and 3:15. The bill was not examined. Either it went on an account or it was settled with the quiet dispatch of a man who does not perform the act of paying. Back into the car, which had been waiting. The driver asked nothing. You said nothing, or said a single word about where next. The afternoon resumed. The martinis did not entirely dissipate until around 4, which was not long before cocktail hour anyway, and so in a certain sense the 1960s New York day of a wealthy man was one sustained, gently oscillating relationship with alcohol, managed gracefully, interrupted by intervals of sharp, purposeful clarity, and understood by everyone involved to be simply how things were done. For the men of inherited or accumulated wealth, the office was a complicated place. It was where you were expected to be in theory, between roughly 10 and 4, though no one would have clocked you. It was a place that justified the suits, the car, the sense that your day had structure. Some of these men worked genuinely hard, ran banks, law firms, corporations, and the corner office on the 35th floor of a midtown tower was a real operational headquarters. But for others, the office was more of a theatrical prop, a place to read the journal, take calls, have the secretary hold everything unpleasant, and cultivate the impression of purposeful activity. Either way, the commute was the same. A black car pulled up, the doorman held the door, and you arrived without ever touching a subway handle. The office itself, at the level we're discussing, was a room that communicated the right things. Dark wood or leather, or both. A desk that was either very clear, suggesting controlled mastery, or very full, suggesting consequential busyness. A view, always a view, because a view was the office equivalent of a good table at a restaurant. You either had one or you didn't, and everyone knew which. On the credenza behind the desk, framed photographs. Family, yes, but also the handshakes, the moments with important people, the evidence that you moved in circles that included faces the visitor would recognize and be appropriately impressed by. None of this was accidental. The office was curated as carefully as the apartment, for the same reasons. The secretary was essential. She was almost certainly a woman, almost certainly efficient beyond what the job description suggested, almost certainly underpaid relative to what she actually managed. She held a calendar. She knew which calls to put through and which ones to say he was unavailable for, which was a diplomatic skill of the first order, delivering the message that someone was unreachable without delivering the message that they were being avoided, though of course they were. She organised the correspondence, managed the door, and kept track of things her employer would have been unable to locate or reconstruct on his own. She was also, in a particular and practical way, the most informed person in the office, knowing as she did the contents of every letter and the subject of every call. Work, for the man who had chosen or been handed his position, varied enormously in what it actually required. For the serious banker or lawyer, the days were long and genuinely demanding. The deals were real, the stakes were real, the expertise required was real and had been acquired over years of effort. These men were tired in the evening in the way that substantive work makes you tired, and the 3-martini lunch was a reward as much as a ritual. For others, the office was the mechanism by which a family's holdings were supervised, trusts administered, investments reviewed, the occasional board meeting attended, and this too was real, though it required fewer hours of active effort and more hours of the appearance of active effort, which is its own form of labour, and not an easy one. At 4 o'clock, or thereabouts, the day at the office concluded. The car was called. The briefcase, which may or may not have contained anything requiring attention at home, was collected. The secretary was thanked briefly. The elevator descended. The lobby of the building was crossed, and the man who had been whoever he was in that office all day stepped back into the car and began the transition back into being whoever he was in the apartment. A shift that happened in the back seat, in the 10 or 15 minutes of silence between Midtown and Park Avenue, while the city moved past the windows and the driver kept his eyes on the road and said nothing, as he had been, over years, quietly trained to do. Here is the thing no one tells you about old money in 1960s New York. The social calendar was not a luxury. It was an obligation. It was, for many people at the top of the hierarchy, the primary mechanism by which status was maintained, alliances were managed, and the correct impression was continuously projected into the world. There were galas and benefits and charity dinners and opening nights and private dinners and house parties in the Hamptons and weekends in the country, and lunches that functioned as strategy sessions and cocktail parties that functioned as auditions. Missing the wrong event was noticed. Being seen at the right one, in the right outfit, with the right people, was not pleasure. It was maintenance. The calendar was managed the way a business manages its obligations, with a secretary, with advanced planning, with decisions made months out about what required attendance and what could be declined with a politely worded note and a generous donation. Certain events were non-negotiable: the Met benefit, the library gala, the hospital ball, events whose guest lists were themselves the list, the one that confirmed you were still there, still present, still part of the structure. Missing one of these was not simply an absence, it was a data point, noticed by the people who noticed everything, filed away, and occasionally mentioned in the kind of quiet observational way that functions in this world as both assessment and warning. Accepting an invitation required its own calculation. Who else would be there? What the event was in aid of, and whether associating yourself with it was politically sensible. Whether the hostess was someone whose standing you wanted to be seen endorsing. Whether you owed a debt of social reciprocity that made attendance mandatory regardless of interest. Whether you'd already been seen too frequently with these particular people this season and needed to diversify. This sounds paranoid when listed plainly. It was not paranoid. It was an accurate description of how the social mathematics of that world actually functioned, and the people who were good at it, and some people were very good at it, moved through the season with a precision that looked effortless, and was anything but. Declining required equal care. You could not simply not go. You could not say you were busy, because busy was too thin an explanation among people who understood how these schedules worked. You could be unwell, which was the most reliable excuse and the most broadly accepted. You could be out of the city, which required some forethought but was clean. You could send your regrets, a handwritten note, never a phone call for a formal event, certainly never nothing, with the appropriate warmth and the appropriate reference to the cause or the hostess, and you hoped that the relationship was solid enough to absorb the absence without requiring explanation. The summer provided some relief, in theory. Once the city emptied in June, the calendar thinned for several weeks, but it resumed immediately in the Hamptons, where the same cast of characters was simply operating at slightly lower temperature and slightly higher casual register. Weekend house parties, beach club lunches, tennis afternoons that shaded into cocktail evenings that extended into late dinners, the calendar followed you out of the city like a very well-dressed shadow. By October, when everyone returned and the season resumed in earnest, there was a collective, unspoken acknowledgement that the next 6 months would be full. Your desk would accumulate invitations, thick card envelopes with the right typefaces and the return addresses that told you before you opened them what you were being asked to do. You would say yes to most, and no to some, and to the ones you were most obligated to. You would say yes even when you were tired, because the social calendar was not built for tired. It was built for the proposition that your presence in the right room, at the right time, was a contribution to something larger than your own evening, a maintenance of the fabric of a world that existed and continued to exist, precisely because everyone showed up. The wealthy residents of 1960s New York did not simply own apartments, they curated them. Every surface was the result of a decision, usually made in consultation with a decorator whose name you dropped the way other people drop the names of restaurants, casually, as if everyone had access, knowing perfectly well they did not. The interiors of the great Park Avenue and Fifth Avenue apartments of the era were masterclasses in a very particular aesthetic, formal but not stiff, expensive but not ostentatious, stuffed with good things that were meant to look as though they had always been there and had never been shopped for. Lacquered walls, chinoiserie, upholstered furniture in colours that had no simple names, and somewhere, in a guest bathroom no one actually used, a bowl of potpourri that a housekeeper refreshed weekly without being asked. The decorator occupied a peculiar position in the social ecosystem, intimate enough to have access to the most private rooms, professional enough to maintain the boundary, influential enough that his or her taste was absorbed into the apartment and then forgotten, so that in 5 years you would describe your own aesthetic as if you had invented it, rather than being guided to it by someone who charged accordingly. The great decorators of the era, Sister Parish, Billy Baldwin, the names that circulated in the right circles, were not merely people who chose fabric. They were architects of environment, creators of the stage on which the life of the household would be performed. Choosing one was itself a statement. It told people something about you before they had set foot inside. Renovation was expensive and perpetual. Apartments of the right vintage had good bones. The pre-war buildings on Park and Fifth, with their generous rooms and their well-proportioned proportions, but bones required dressing, and dressing required decisions, and decisions required the decorator, and the decorator required time, and time required patience, and patience required that you live for several months in a state of productive disruption, eating in a kitchen surrounded by paint samples and explaining to your guests that the drawing room would be finished by October. October frequently extended to January. The furniture itself was an accumulation of layers. There were pieces inherited, the good mahogany desk that came from the husband's family, the pair of chairs that had been in the wife's family's house in Connecticut, and there were pieces acquired, from dealers on Madison Avenue and through auction houses and occasionally through the decorator who had access to things before they became available. The principle was coherence without uniformity, the illusion that this collection of objects from different centuries and different sources had arrived together by the natural logic of taste, rather than the deliberate decisions of acquisition. Good decorators could achieve this. Great decorators could achieve it while also making you feel that you had done it yourself. And then there was the question of art, which overlapped with the apartment's identity, but operated according to its own rules. The paintings on the walls said something about what you valued and understood and were willing to pay for, and in the 1960s, when the contemporary art market was beginning to do the extraordinary things it would do, getting this right had both aesthetic and financial dimensions that were interestingly tangled. Some people bought for the look, some for the investment, some because a dealer they trusted said this artist was important, and it was generally better to believe that than not. The result, in the best apartments of the era, was rooms that felt complete, in the way that only rooms with histories feel complete. Not decorated but inhabited, not assembled but accrued, every object with a reason for being exactly where it was, even if that reason had long since been absorbed into the general rightness of the whole. You walked through these rooms and felt that nothing could be moved without disturbing something essential, which was exactly what the decorator had intended, and which was ultimately the highest possible compliment you could pay the enterprise. The wealthy wife of 1960s New York occupied a role that was simultaneously one of the most demanding and least acknowledged in the city. She managed the household, a complex organism of staff, schedules, social obligations and domestic infrastructure, while projecting an air of effortless leisure so convincing that even she occasionally forgot the work involved. She organized the dinner parties that advanced her husband's career. She maintained the friendships that formed the social web that determined where they stood. She kept the children on schedule, the apartment in order, the staff from quitting, and the appearance of serenity so polished and consistent that it became indistinguishable from the real thing, which it was not quite. Her morning began earlier than it looked. Before she appeared in the dining room, the housekeeper had already been consulted, the cook had already received her instructions for the evening, and 2 decisions had been made about the dinner on Saturday that required some thought, but could not appear to have required any thought, because effortlessness was the operating principle of the entire life. The invitations on the desk had been reviewed. The response notes had been drafted in her head, if not yet on paper. The children's schedules had been checked against the week's obligations. She'd done all of this before the coffee tray arrived and before anyone who lived with her had any idea it was happening. She had in many cases a college education that she was not using, not in any way the college had imagined when they admitted her. She was intelligent. She read. She had opinions about things that were not the dinner menu or the seating chart, and in the right company, the right friends, the private lunches, the rare evenings when the conversation went somewhere real, she expressed them with the precision of someone who'd spent years observing the world closely while pretending to merely decorate it. But the structure of the life she'd entered, and that she had entered willingly, with full understanding of its terms, which didn't make the terms less constraining, didn't create many official outlets for intelligence of the kind she possessed. So it went into the household, into the social management, into the raising of children and the maintenance of relationships and the quiet, continuous, largely invisible work of keeping everything together. The social obligations alone constituted a part-time occupation. The charity boards, the committee memberships, the luncheons that required attendance and engagement, and the particular skill of making everyone in the room feel that they had your full and genuine attention, which required a kind of performative presence that was as technically demanding as anything her husband did in his corner office. She was also, frequently, the one managing the relationships that mattered to his career, maintaining warmth with wives who would report back, calibrating the social temperature of evenings that had professional implications, doing the political work through the social channels because the social channels were the ones available to her. At some point in the afternoon there was something for herself, a hair appointment, a fitting, a lunch with a friend that was genuinely pleasant and relatively unperformed, and these pockets of the day were what held the rest together. The friendship, the conversation, the hour that belonged only to her, these were not luxuries in the dismissive sense. They were the maintenance of the self that everything else depended on. Without them, the apparatus, the household, the calendar, the dinner party, the children's schedules, would continue to function for a while on momentum, but it would begin to hollow out, and she would begin to feel the hollowness, and that was something she had been, all her adult life, very carefully working to prevent. In the evening, dressed and ready before her husband had finished his second attempt at the tie, she stood in the drawing room and reviewed the room with the quiet, rapid eye of someone who has done this many times. Everything was right. The flowers were right, the glasses were set, the temperature was correct. In 45 minutes there would be 12 people in this room, and the evening would begin, and she would move through it with warmth and grace, and the particular gift of making each person feel they were the one she had most wanted to see. And nobody, not one of the 12 people who spent the evening in her apartment eating her cook's food and drinking her husband's wine, would have been able to describe, afterward, exactly how much work it had all taken. Children of the truly wealthy in 1960s New York existed in a very specific ecosystem. They were loved, theoretically, by parents who were busy and often physically elsewhere. They were managed, practically speaking, by a nanny, British if the family was trying to signal a certain thing, Irish if they were a generation or two closer to the source of the money and hadn't quite made the full leap. There were the right schools, which began in earnest at age 4, and were themselves competitive in ways that would have seemed unhinged to anyone watching from outside. There were lessons, piano, French, riding, tennis, sailing. Not because anyone expected mastery, but because the exposure itself was the point. A kind of cultural inoculation that would pay dividends in conversation for the rest of their lives. The nanny was, for many of these children, the most consistent adult in their daily world. She was there at breakfast, which the children ate in the kitchen, or a small side room rather than the formal dining room. She managed bedtime, baths, homework on the early evenings, and the logistics of the school run, which the driver also participated in, but which she coordinated. She was the person a child called when something went wrong in the small, immediate way that children's things go wrong, and she handled it with the calm of someone who had done this before and would do it again, and understood that most childhood crises resolve within 30 minutes if you just stay steady. She was not the mother. She was not supposed to be. The distinction was real and maintained. The schools were a world unto themselves. At 4, the nursery school. At 6 or 7, the Right Day School, Brearley or Chapin for girls, Buckley or St Bernard's for boys, where the children of the same families had been going since the families had been the right kind of families. The admissions process for these schools was conducted with the intensity of a diplomatic negotiation, involving the parents' connections, the child's performance at an interview that the child understood was important without being told explicitly why, and a set of criteria that was never fully articulated, but was broadly understood to include everything about the family that the school's director had been able to determine through the application, the interview, and the phone calls she made to people she trusted. At 8, many of the boys would be thinking about boarding school. At 13, they would go. The life of the child at home was comfortable and somewhat constrained. The apartment was not a place where children ran freely. There were rooms they entered and rooms they did not. Times when the drawing room was in use and they were expected to remain elsewhere. Evenings when guests arrived and the children appeared briefly, scrubbed and dressed and presented, before being returned to their wing by the nanny. This was not unkind. It was simply how the household was organised, and the children understood it the way children understand all the rules of their world, as the natural order of things, unremarkable until they were old enough to stand outside it and see it for what it was. They were given a great deal, and they knew it and didn't entirely know it simultaneously, which is the particular state of a child raised in abundance, aware that things are good, not yet equipped to understand the magnitude of the difference between their world and most others. The piano lessons were given by a teacher who came to the apartment. The French was reinforced in summer, sometimes by actual time in France, which the children experienced as largely inconvenient at 8 and retrospectively invaluable at 25. The tennis lessons at the club, the sailing in the summers, the riding in Connecticut, all of it deposited without their active awareness into an account of cultural fluency they would spend the rest of their lives drawing on. What they sometimes lacked, and what no amount of money could efficiently provide, was the ordinary, unsupervised time of childhood, the unstructured afternoons, the freedom to be bored and then find their own way out of boredom, the presence of parents who were simply present rather than appearing at scheduled intervals in good clothes. Some of them grew up close to their parents despite all this, through the specific chemistry of personality and luck. Others grew up comfortable strangers who met their parents at dinner and over school holidays, and were fond of them in a formal, slightly formal way that neither party had fully chosen and neither fully knew how to change. Your name was put up for membership before you were old enough to have an opinion about it. Someone, your father's friend, a man whose face you associated with Christmas dinners and firm handshakes, made a phone call, signed a letter, and set in motion the process by which you would eventually become a member of a club you had not chosen and would never seriously consider leaving. The social clubs of 1960s New York were not, technically, places of power. They were places for lunch, for squash, for a quiet drink at the end of a long day of pretending to be less powerful than you were. And yet somehow, in the dim wood-panelled rooms of the Knickerbocker or the Brook or the Union Club, more of the city's actual business got done than in any boardroom. Membership was not applied for so much as inherited, like bone structure or a certain way of holding a fork. You were put up by someone, seconded by someone else, and reviewed by a committee whose criteria were never written down anywhere because they didn't need to be. Everyone who mattered already knew the physical spaces themselves were designed to produce a very specific feeling. The feeling of having arrived somewhere that agreed with your presence. The ceilings were high, the leather was old, the portraits on the walls depicted men who'd been members before anyone currently living had been born, which was the point, to communicate continuity, to suggest that the institution predated you and would outlast you, and had, over a very long time, determined what kind of person belonged here, and that you, evidently, were that kind of person. The light was low in the way that expensive spaces are always slightly dim, as though brightness is a thing that happens to other rooms. Lunch was the main event on most days. A table in the corner, or the one by the window if you arrived first, and 2 or 3 men who were themselves members and who had been eating lunch together in this room, or rooms like it, for years. The menu was reliable, not adventurous, not designed to surprise, but consistent in a way that felt like a promise kept. You had the same thing most weeks. The waiter knew without asking. This was not laziness on your part. It was the accumulated dividend of years of patronage, the moment at which the institution began returning what you had put into it. The conversations held at those lunch tables over those years were the actual texture of how New York's financial and professional life was organized. Not the formal meetings with agendas and lawyers present, but the earlier conversations, the ones where positions were established, where the temperature of a proposal was tested, where you learned whether the man across from you was in or out before the question was formally put. The club was the pre-meeting, the pre-negotiation, the space in which the ground was prepared for everything that would happen later in offices and conference rooms. Without it, the offices and conference rooms would have been colder, more adversarial, less efficiently productive. The club was, in this sense, infrastructure. There was also squash, which was taken seriously by the men who played it and watched with polite interest by the men who didn't. And there was the reading room, which was genuinely quiet and genuinely used. And there was the bar, which was where you went after something had either gone well or badly, and where the drink arrived without your having to specify, because the bartender, who had been here longer than most of the members, knew by the way you sat down which you needed and how strong. Women were not members. This was not discussed. It was simply the condition of the place, as unremarkable within it as the portraits on the wall and the low light and the menu that never changed. The 1960s were doing something loud to the question of who belonged where, but inside these rooms the noise was largely inaudible. The wood panelling absorbed it, the leather held its shape, and the committee that reviewed new members continued to review them by criteria that were never written down, and continued to find that the right kind of person was, broadly speaking, the same kind of person it had always been. Shopping for the wealthy woman of 1960s New York was not browsing. It was an appointment. You arrived at Bergdorf's or Bendel's and were greeted by someone who knew you, who pulled things in your size before you asked, who offered coffee and managed the whole experience with the discretion of a private medical consultation. No one riffled through racks. No one checked a price tag, at least not visibly, and certainly not out loud. The bill was sent. Payment was arranged through other channels entirely. Jewellery required a different approach. Quiet rooms above street level at Van Cleef or Harry Winston, where pieces were brought out on velvet for your consideration, and where the transaction had the hush of something ceremonial, which, in its way, it was. Bergdorf Goodman occupied the corner of Fifth Avenue and 58th Street, with the confidence of a place that knew exactly what it was and had no interest in being anything else. Its floors were organized by category and quality, and navigating them correctly required a knowledge of which floor to go to and which person to ask for, because the store was, beneath its elegant surface, a system through which the right customer moved, efficiently and comfortably, and the wrong customer experienced in small impersonal ways that they had come to the wrong place. You were the right customer. You had been the right customer since you first came here as a teenager with your mother, who had been the right customer since she first came here with hers. The woman who helped you had been helping your family for years. She remembered your mother's preferences. She remembered yours. The transaction was never discussed in terms of cost during the appointment itself. You looked at things. You tried things occasionally. You made decisions. The items were set aside, wrapped, boxed, or in some cases held to be collected later by the driver. The bill arrived at the apartment in an envelope, which was dealt with by the secretary or opened privately, noted, and filed in the mental category of household expenditure that was understood to be necessary and not examined too closely. This arrangement, the physical separation of the acquisition from the payment, the buffer of time and intermediary between the pleasure of the object and the fact of the cost, was one of the small, elegant mechanisms by which the wealthy managed to spend very large amounts of money without the experience of spending ever feeling quite real. For men, the shopping was different in character, but equally systematized. The tailor came to you, or you went to him at a set appointment. The shoemaker had your last on file, the templates of your feet in wood, stored in a numbered box so that reorders required no measurement, only instruction. The shirtmaker knew your neck and sleeve and whether you preferred a firmer collar. These relationships were long, stable, and almost entirely impersonal in their warmth, meaning they were warm, genuinely warm, but the warmth was professional, and both parties understood its nature. You were a good client. They were reliable craftsmen. The exchange was clean. Gift buying occupied its own category and required a different skill. The right gift, for a host, for a child's birthday, for a social event that required a gesture, was chosen from the network of shops on Madison Avenue that catered specifically to people who needed to give expensive things that did not look as though their price had been considered. Stationery, objects, leather goods with the quiet logos of houses that had been making things for a century and expected to continue for another. The gift arrived wrapped in paper that was itself an announcement of where it came from, and the recipient understood before unwrapping it approximately what category of effort and expenditure they were being honoured with. All of this, the appointments, the accounts, the bills in envelopes, the shoemaker with the wooden lasts, the quiet rooms at Van Cleef where the sapphires came out on velvet, constituted a parallel economy that ran adjacent to the city's normal commercial life, but rarely intersected with it. You did not shop where other people shopped. You did not wait where other people waited. You moved through a version of commerce that had been specifically engineered to remove every friction between wanting something and having it, and the only price, beyond the money, was that you never again quite experienced the ordinary grounding pleasure of choosing something for yourself from among things you couldn't all afford. The dinner party was the highest art form of 1960s New York high society, and like all high art forms, it looked effortless from the outside while requiring an almost deranged amount of planning and coordination behind the scenes. Flowers were ordered from the same florist on the same street who had been doing it for 20 years. The menu was constructed with the cook days in advance, balancing elegance with the specific dietary constraints of 18 guests, 2 of whom had mentioned something about beef, and 1 of whom had simply stopped eating things without explanation. The seating chart was drafted, discarded, and redrafted at least 3 times, because who sat next to whom was a statement, and you had better mean what you were saying. The invitations went out 3 to 4 weeks in advance, earlier for the large formal dinners, slightly less for the smaller, more intimate evenings that were actually the ones that mattered most. The formal dinner for 20 was a production, impressive and occasionally enjoyable, but the dinner for 8 or 10, the right 8 or 10, the people who genuinely talked to each other and produced the kind of conversation that made the evening feel like something that had actually happened rather than something that had been professionally executed, was rarer and more valuable. The hostess spent real thought on this. She was, in the construction of a dinner table, operating as both casting director and dramatist. assembling people who would generate something, whose chemistries and tensions and enthusiasms would produce an evening that justified the flowers and the 7 courses and the wine she had selected with her husband 2 evenings ago from the cellar. The table itself was set in the afternoon. The good china, not the everyday things, not the slightly lesser things kept for family breakfasts, but the actual good china. The pieces she had chosen before she was married and had been protecting ever since, came down from wherever it was stored, was checked for chips that were not there but were always checked for anyway, and was placed with the precision of someone who understood that the distance between a plate and the edge of the table was not arbitrary. The silver was already polished. The glasses were already positioned. The flowers arrived at 4 and were arranged by the florist herself, who had done this table before and knew the height and the colours and the particular effect the light had on this room in the evening. Guests arrived at 7:30, which meant they arrived between 7:40 and 8, because arriving at the stated time at a dinner party was considered a kind of social aggression, a failure to understand that the stated time was a suggestion, a convention everyone observed without anyone having explained it to anyone else. Cocktails were served in the drawing room. The hostess moved between people with a glass she rarely drank from. The host was easier to locate. He was wherever the best conversation was, or wherever he needed to be to prevent a social weather system from developing in the corner near the fireplace. By 8:30, the table was ready, and the cook's patience was a finite resource, and the transition was managed with the timing of a stage cue. At the table, the conversation was the real event. The food was the occasion for the conversation, the punctuation between exchanges, the shared object of mild, appreciative attention that gave people something to do with their hands during the pauses. A good dinner party produced 2 or 3 moments of genuine exchange, things said that were actually interesting, observations or stories or arguments that people remembered afterward. The hostess had usually engineered at least one of these moments by her placement decisions and her careful introduction of a subject in the right moment to the right person, which looked like spontaneity, and was nothing of the kind. The evening ended between 10:30 and midnight, depending on the energy of the table. Guests said their goodbyes in the foyer, with the warmth of people who had been pleasantly fed and well entertained, and who were already, on some level, recalibrating their assessment of their hostess upward, which she knew, and which was precisely what she'd worked all week to produce. The door closed. The apartment fell quiet. The staff began to clear. The hostess sat down for the first time since 4 o'clock, took off her shoes, and accepted a small glass of something that appeared without her having to ask. She reviewed the evening in the private court of her own judgment. It had gone well. She already knew what she would do differently next time. Every family of serious standing had somewhere to go on weekends. The Hamptons were becoming fashionable, though some of the old guard still found them a little conspicuous. Connecticut was respectable. Westchester was comfortable. Some had places in Newport or Bar Harbor that dated back to a time before anyone living could remember acquiring them, which was itself a kind of credential. The country house was ostensibly a retreat, fresh air, a garden, a change of pace. In practice, it was the city reproduced at a slightly lower temperature, with the same cast of characters, the same social hierarchies, and the same anxiety about who had been invited and who conspicuously had not. Now outdoors and somehow more fraught because there was nowhere to go home to. The house itself was substantial, not the largest house on the road, that would have been ostentatious in the wrong direction, but comfortably large, with enough bedrooms to accommodate the weekend guests that the ownership of a country house implied, and enough land around it to suggest that the previous generation had acquired it when land was available and had held it since, which was the most comfortable story. There was a garden, managed by someone who came several days a week and whose work was appreciated and credited in the abstract, but whose specific methods were not inquired into. There was a tennis court, because there was always a tennis court. There was a pool put in sometime in the 50s, around which a great deal of Saturday afternoon was organised. Friday evening was the journey. The car was loaded, not by you. The bags had already appeared at the door and been placed in the trunk by whoever placed things in trunks, and the departure happened sometime between 4 and 6. Ideally before the worst of the traffic, though the traffic was already becoming the thing everyone complained about on the way there and analysed on the way back. The conversation in the car between husband and wife was either companionable or strained depending on the week, and the children, if they were coming, occupied the back with a nanny and the particular energy of children who had been inside a Manhattan apartment all week and were now in a moving vehicle on the way somewhere larger. The arrival at the house had its own ritual. The lights were on because someone had come ahead, the caretaker or the housekeeper who also managed the country property, and the house was warm and the kitchen was stocked and the beds were made. You walked through the rooms with the mild, proprietary pleasure of someone checking that a thing they own continues to exist, which it did, as it had every weekend for years. The air smelled different from the city. This was noticed and appreciated and then set aside because dinner needed to happen. Saturday was the peak of the weekend's social activity. Lunch was often at the club, the beach club in the Hamptons, the country club in Connecticut, and lunch at the club was a version of lunch in the city, except that the dress code was somewhat relaxed, and the children were sometimes present, and the conversation had the slightly more expansive quality of people who were nominally on holiday. Tennis in the afternoon, or a walk, or the pool, or a combination of all three, depending on who among the guests was interested in what. Cocktails at 6. Dinner, either at home with guests or out at the restaurant that everyone in this crowd used when they didn't want to cook. Sunday morning arrived with the mild melancholy of things ending. Breakfast was the most relaxed meal of the weekend, late, informal by the standards of everything else, conducted around a large table in the kitchen or on the terrace if the weather permitted. The newspapers were read, coffee was refilled. Someone mentioned they should probably think about heading back, and this was agreed to in principle but not acted upon for another 2 hours, because Sunday morning at the country house was genuinely the best part of the whole arrangement. The drive back to the city happened in the late afternoon, into the sun, with the traffic and the tiredness and the particular feeling of a weekend that had been full of people and food and the outdoors, and which had not quite been the rest it was supposed to be, but had been its own thing, which was enough. His name was probably something one-syllable and reliable. Frank, Ray, Ed, and he had been with the family for somewhere between 5 and 30 years. He knew the schedule before the family did. He knew which appointments were real and which were invented to avoid other appointments. He knew the addresses of people whose existence was never discussed at dinner. He knew which restaurants required the car to wait, and which ones meant he should plan for 2 hours, possibly 3 if the lunch went well or badly, depending on interpretation. He said very little. He remembered everything. He was paid in cash, tipped generously at Christmas, and would be the last person anyone thought to ask if they really wanted to understand how this family's life actually worked. The car was a black sedan, a Lincoln Continental or a Cadillac, depending on the year and the preference, kept in a garage a block and a half from the building and produced each morning at the requested time, engine running, the interior at the temperature it needed to be before the passenger got in. This level of preparation was not discussed or acknowledged. It was simply the standard, established over years, and the driver maintained it the way he maintained everything, without announcement, as a matter of professional dignity. The car was clean. The car was on time. The car was there when it needed to be there. If it was once not there, that story was not told because it had not happened. He drove by a set of routes he had established through years of experience, routes that avoided certain intersections at certain times, that anticipated the particular failure modes of midtown traffic on a Tuesday versus a Thursday, that kept the journey to appointments calibrated so that you arrived slightly early without having to wait long, which was the ideal. You never asked about routes. You sat in the back and read or thought or looked out the window and trusted that wherever you were going there correctly. This trust was one of the quiet, daily gifts of the arrangement, the simple relief of not having to think about a thing, delegated completely and without reservation. What he knew about the family's life was considerable and was held in silence. He knew who was picked up where and at what hour. He knew the return trips that happened at unusual times on unusual days. He knew the addresses in neighbourhoods that didn't match the official social geography of the family's life. He knew, from the character of the silences in the back seat, the texture of evenings that had gone wrong, the drive home from a dinner party where something had happened, where two people sat in the back without speaking, looking at separate windows while the city moved past outside. He knew all of this and said nothing, not to the doorman, not to the housekeeper, not to anyone, because saying things was not his function, and because, practically speaking, saying things would have ended the job, and the job was a good job, and he was a man who understood the value of a good job held for a long time. He was not invisible. He was greeted every morning, thanked at the end of the day, included in the household's general awareness in the way that all the staff were included. But he occupied a particular kind of discretion that was its own form of presence. He was there without intruding. He was useful without requiring management. He was the most reliable element of the daily infrastructure, more reliable than the calendar, more consistent than the cook's moods, more predictable than the weather. At Christmas, the envelope was generous. On the occasion of significant family events, a birth, a graduation, a death, he drove to the right place and waited as long as necessary and said the appropriate thing upon return, which was usually nothing or very little, measured carefully. He attended the family's life from its edges for years, sometimes decades, and when he retired, if he retired, there was a dinner or a gift and a genuine sadness at his absence that surprised slightly the people who felt it, because they had not until that moment fully calculated how large a space he had quietly occupied. By the 1960s, seeing a psychiatrist on the Upper East Side had crossed the invisible line from stigma to status symbol, though no one was exactly advertising it. The right analyst, the right hours, the right address on East 72nd Street. These things communicated something about you, namely that you were the kind of person who took the inner life seriously, who was engaged in the serious business of self-examination, who was doing the work. The fact that the work in question was largely conducted while lying on a couch talking about your mother for 50 minutes 4 days a week was understood, but not discussed. Everyone was in analysis. No one talked about what was said in analysis. It was the most expensive form of privacy available, and in New York, privacy was worth almost anything. The analyst's office was typically in a brownstone or a pre-war building, a few floors up, with a waiting room that was small and carpeted and contained a white noise machine outside the door. This detail universally present, universally noted, universally not commented upon, because the white noise machine was there to prevent the person waiting from hearing the person inside, and the person waiting preferred to maintain the fiction that what happened inside was entirely inaudible, as they would maintain the same fiction when it was their turn to be inside. The chairs in the waiting room were chosen to be unremarkable. You did not make eye contact with the other patient you occasionally encountered on the way in or out. This was understood. It was one of the rules that nobody had written down. Psychoanalysis had arrived in New York from Vienna via the refugee intellectuals who had fled Europe in the 30s and 40s and brought with them a set of ideas about the unconscious, the childhood, the repressed, that found in the anxious, ambitious, overachieving environment of the Upper East Side a receptive and inexhaustible patient population. By the 1960s, analysis had become embedded in the culture of a certain class to such a degree that not being an analysis required, in some circles, a mild explanation. Not aggressive, not demanding, but present, the way the absence of a country house presence required a mild explanation. Oh, you're not? No. Well, some people find other things. The conversation moved on. The analyst himself, and it was more often a him, though women analysts existed and had their own specific prestige, was a figure of considerable authority, which sat interestingly alongside the fact that he said very little during the sessions themselves. He was trained to listen, to reflect back, to ask questions that opened rather than closed. He was not supposed to advise, he was supposed to illuminate. Whether this worked, in any measurable sense, was a question the patients rarely asked directly, both because the framework of the therapy discouraged that kind of instrumental evaluation, and because the alternative to it being useful was that you had spent several years and a significant sum lying on a couch to no particular end, which was not a thought one entertained. What analysis provided practically and socially was a container for the things that couldn't be said elsewhere. The marriage's actual texture, the drink that was more than social, the ambition that couldn't be expressed directly, the unhappiness that had no legitimate source, given that everything was so clearly in order. This last one was the most common and the most genuinely difficult. The unhappiness without a cause, the life arranged to produce contentment that inexplicably failed to produce it, and the analyst's couch was the only place in the life of many of these people where that particular mystery was given any official attention. It was a room in which honesty was the entire point, which made it unlike almost every other room in the life being analysed. You paid the fee, which was significant and was not discussed. You attended 4 times a week for years, sometimes a decade or more. You developed a relationship with this person you paid to listen to. You that was unlike any other relationship in your life, intimate in its content, asymmetrical in its structure, bounded by the hour in ways that no other human connection was bounded. And somewhere in this peculiar arrangement, in the weekly accumulation of sessions and silences, and the occasional thing said that you didn't expect to say, some of these people found something genuinely useful, and others found mostly that they had spent a great deal of time and money being made slightly more articulate about their problems, without being materially relieved of them, which was perhaps the best that could be expected from being human in 1963 New York, regardless of the size of the apartment. Going to a restaurant in 1960s New York at the level we are discussing had nothing to do with hunger. It had to do with where you sat, who seated you, whether the maître d' used your name, and how long before they came to take your order. Le Pavillon, under the formidable Henri Sully, operated as an unofficial court where the best tables were guarded with a territoriality that made medieval castle politics look relaxed. Being given a good table was an honour. Being moved from a good table was a humiliation that people wrote about for years. Being recognised on entry, guided to your usual spot, and presented with whatever you always ordered before you ordered it. This was the whole point. The food was excellent. That was secondary. Le Pavillon had opened in 1941, a transplant of French haute cuisine that had been created for the World's Fair, and stayed because New York turned out to be a city that wanted what it was, offering. By the 1960s it occupied a space on East 55th Street, and had developed, under Soulet's rigorous and frequently arbitrary management, a social geography that was as precisely mapped as any territory. The front room held the people who mattered, the regulars, the known names, the figures from finance and media and fashion who returned often enough to have been granted the status of belonging. The back room held everyone else, The people who had made a reservation but not a reputation, the tourists who had read about the place, the aspirants who had not yet ascended. Moving someone from front to back was an act of social punishment so effective and so public that it required no explanation. The demotion was the message. Soule himself was the architect of this system, and he managed it with the autocratic confidence of someone who understood that the restaurant's value derived almost entirely from the curation of who was seen there. He was not, by all accounts, a warm man in the conventional sense. He was exacting, demanding, occasionally cruel to his staff, and deeply attentive to the social mechanics of the room in a way that bordered on obsessive. He also produced in the kitchen food of genuine and serious quality, the escargot, the sole meunière, the soufflés, that justified the existence of the room surrounding it. But the food was the vehicle, the room was the destination. There were other establishments in the rotation. The Four Seasons, which opened in 1959 in the Seagram building, brought a different energy, modern, architectural, the rooms themselves a statement of a certain mid-century confidence, and attracted a lunch crowd of publishers, advertising executives, and media figures whose social currency was more current and more volatile than the old money crowd. 21 on West 52nd Street had the convivial warmth of a very expensive club, with its jockey statues and its celebrity photographs, and its lock-up wine cellar maintained for favoured clients. Each establishment had its own social map, its own hierarchy of tables, its own signals. What you were actually doing when you went to any of these places was participating in a system of public self-presentation so efficient that it accomplished in a 2-hour lunch what would otherwise require weeks of correspondence and social manoeuvring. You were seen. You were seen with certain people. You were seen being treated a certain way by the institution you had chosen to be seen in. All of this produced information for the room, for the city, for anyone who paid attention to where serious people ate and who they ate with. And information of this kind, in this world, was always in circulation and always in use. The tip was generous. The relationship with the maître d' was maintained with the same care as any other important professional relationship, because it was one. You left with a particular satisfaction of a public appearance that had gone correctly, of having been in the right room and been recognised as belonging there, which was what you had come for, and which you would, next week, come for again. In the 1960s, collecting art was what serious money did with itself. You bought from galleries on 57th Street, or through dealers who called you first before anything went to the public, which was the whole point of the relationship. The canvases were large. The sculpture was placed with the help of someone whose job title was murky, but whose eye was considered reliable. The collection was insured for amounts that were staggering but not discussed, the way you might not discuss the cost of a medical procedure, understood to be significant, mentioned only in the abstract. At dinner parties, people stood in front of paintings and said things that sounded considered. Later, privately, someone would lean over and say they'd paid too much or too little, depending on who the artist had become since the purchase. The relationship with the dealer was central to the whole enterprise, and it was a relationship in the genuine sense, ongoing, reciprocal, built over time and maintained with the same social architecture as any other important connection in this world. The good dealers were not merely salespeople. They were trusted advisors who educated you, who brought things to your attention before they were broadly sought, who explained the significance of what you were looking at in terms that you could absorb and eventually reproduce at the dinner table when someone asked about the large canvas in the drawing room. You deferred to their judgment more than you might have liked to admit, because your own judgment in these matters was partially constructed from the knowledge they had given you, and there was a circular quality to the whole thing that you generally preferred not to examine too closely. The 1960s were an extraordinary decade to be buying American art. Abstract expressionism had made New York the centre of the contemporary art world, displacing Paris with a confidence that still felt slightly miraculous to anyone who remembered what Paris had been. The names Rothko, de Kooning, Klein, Frankenthaler were becoming known to people who had never thought about painting before, and their work was appearing in the apartments of collectors who had, in some cases, made their money in industries that had nothing whatever to do with art and who had arrived at collecting through social adjacency. A friend who collected, a dealer who called, a dinner at someone's apartment where the work on the walls was so obviously good that something shifted, and the next week you were at 57th Street asking to see what was available. The hanging of the collection was its own discipline. Not everything could go everywhere, and the decisions about what went on which wall in which room were made with the seriousness of architectural choices, because in a way that was what they were. The decorator was sometimes consulted, the dealer had opinions, your own eye, developed over years of looking and acquiring and occasionally regretting, had its own view. The result was the apartment's particular visual personality, the combination of inherited furniture and acquired art that made one rich New York apartment distinct from another rich New York apartment, in ways that were immediately apparent to anyone who paid attention to these things, and entirely invisible to anyone who didn't. The social dimension of collecting was inseparable from the aesthetic one. Being seen at certain openings, the museum previews, the gallery shows that attracted the right crowd, was part of the identity of the serious collector. You knew the artists, some of them, or knew people who knew them. You attended the benefits that supported institutions whose collections intersected with your interests. You lent pieces occasionally to exhibitions that requested them, which generated the particular pleasure of seeing something you owned on a museum wall with a small label that included your name, a pleasure you were not supposed to admit to finding pleasurable, and which you found enormously pleasurable. At some point in the future, this was understood but not planned for in any detail. The collection would go somewhere, to children who might or might not care about it, to a museum in a bequest negotiated with tax implications in mind, or to auction, where what you had paid and what it was now worth would be public in a way that was either gratifying or embarrassing, depending on how the decades between purchase and sale had treated the artist's reputation. But that was the future, for now the painting was on the wall. The light caught it in the morning, and every so often walking past it on your way to something else, you stopped and looked and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite satisfaction, but was real and was yours and needed no explanation. Charity in 1960s. New York society was not optional, and it was not particularly private. The benefit gala was the mechanism through which the social calendar and civic obligation were neatly combined, which suited everyone enormously. You bought a table, or several tables, because buying several was noted, at the Museum of Natural History or the Metropolitan Opera or the New York Public Library. You appeared in the correct evening clothes, you were photographed by the right people, and the money did in fact go somewhere useful, which was a secondary but genuine benefit. Sitting on a charity board was its own credential, requiring time, organisational effort, and the ability to manage personalities in a room without anyone realising you were doing it. The women were very good at this, better frequently than anyone gave them credit for. The benefit season ran from October through June, with a particular concentration in the winter months when the full social population was in the city and available to be marshalled. Each institution had its signature event, the Met Ball, which was becoming one of the most significant evenings of the season. The library's gala, which attracted the literary and publishing world alongside the social. The hospital benefits, which were supported with the particular motivation of people who understood that good hospitals were something everyone might one day need. The tables were priced at levels that made them accessible only to the people they were designed for, and the seating within the event replicated in its own way the the geography of the restaurant. Who was at which table, how close to the dais, how visible to the room, was information that read clearly to everyone present. The committee work was where the actual labour happened, and it was considerable. Organising a benefit gala for 500 people required months of preparation. The venue, the catering, the entertainment, the silent auction, if there was one, the invitation list, the seating, the printing, the correspondence, the management of the inevitable interpersonal tensions among committee members who had strong opinions about everything and the social authority to make those opinions felt. The women who chaired these committees were, in organisational terms, operating at an executive level. They managed budgets, vendors, volunteers, board members, and the public face of the institution they were representing, and they did it without titles or salaries, which was the particular absurdity of the arrangement that most of them were too polite or too embedded in the system to name. The photography was part of the function. The society pages of newspapers and the glossy magazines that covered these events, Town and Country, Vogue, the newspaper columns that tracked who appeared where served as the public record of the charity circuit, confirming attendance, validating the event's importance, and providing the visual evidence that the right people had shown up. Being photographed was not an act of vanity exactly. Or not only that, it was a form of institutional endorsement, a public commitment that carried its own social weight. You appeared in the photograph because appearing in the photograph was part of what you were there to do. It said, "This cause is worth my presence. My presence is worth recording." The giving itself was real. The money that changed hands at these events, the table purchases, the auction bids, the direct donations solicited by the board was substantial, and it funded things of genuine importance: medical research, arts programming, library acquisitions, education initiatives. The fact that it was also socially mandatory and publicly performed and photographed for the society pages did not make it less real. It made it a more complex thing than simple charity, but complexity did not negate the outcome. The research got funded, the institution survived, the cause was served. What the charity circuit also served was the need of the women who ran it for work that was legitimate, recognised, and substantive within the terms of the world they were living in. It was not the work they might have chosen in another configuration of the world, but it was real work, and they were good at it, and the institutions they served were better for their involvement. The Metropolitan Opera did not know, precisely, how much it owed to the women who spent October through May on committees fighting about table arrangements and invitation wording. But without them, it would have found out. Marriage at the top of the New York social hierarchy in the 1960s was a more complicated institution than it appeared from the outside, which was to say it appeared perfectly stable and was, structurally speaking, anything but. Divorce was possible, it happened, but it was still considered a kind of event, something to be managed and explained and recovered from, particularly for women, whose social position was more directly tied to the marriage than the man's was. Affairs existed, quietly, discreetly, in ways that everyone knew about and no one acknowledged, because acknowledgement would have required consequences, and consequences were inconvenient. What the marriage actually looked like behind the front door of the apartment depended on the people involved, but the front it presented to the world was consistent, coordinated, attending the same events, photographed together at galas, the unit intact. The marriages that worked in this world worked on a particular understanding, that the public life of the marriage and the private life of the marriage were two different projects, maintained in parallel, with the public one subject to a standard of performance that the private one was not. In public you were partners, in the photographs, at the dinner table, at the events, in the coordination of the social schedule, and this partnership was genuine in its way, built on shared interests and shared obligations and the accumulated history of a life conducted together, the children and the apartments and the summers and the years. It was not nothing. It was in many cases the primary bond of two people's adult lives. The private life was more variable. Some of these marriages were, behind the front door, genuinely warm, people who had chosen each other and continued to find in each other something that justified the choice, who talked at the end of the evening when the guests had gone, and who held in common a version of the world that made being in the same room feel like a relief rather than an obligation. These marriages existed. They were perhaps not the majority, but they were real, and the people in them were, by the standards of the life they were living, quietly fortunate. Others operated in a kind of civilized distance, maintained by schedule and social obligation and the shared project of the household and the children. The husband and wife in these arrangements were not enemies. They were not even, most of the time, unhappy. They were simply living adjacent lives that happened to share an address and a social identity. They were polite to each other. They functioned at dinners and events as a unit. What they didn't particularly do was talk, not about the things that required talking about, the disappointments and the distances and the question of whether this was what either of them had expected, which it was not quite, but which neither of them had the vocabulary or the permission to address. Affairs, when they existed, were managed with the seriousness of a second responsibility, which in many ways they were. Discretion was the operative value. The wrong person seen in the wrong place at the wrong time was the failure mode, and failing this particular test had consequences, social consequences, the kind that redistributed standing and sympathy, and produced the particular turbulence that this world most strongly preferred to avoid. So the discretion was maintained, and the marriage continued, and the apartment was run, and the calendar was kept, and the children were produced and educated, and the events were attended, and the photographs were taken, and from the outside, which was the only side most people ever saw, everything looked precisely as it was supposed to look. By the 1960s, the Hamptons were well on their way to becoming the summer capital of New York money, even as some of the older families still muttered about the crowds and affected a preference for somewhere quieter, which they also owned a house in. Southampton was the original, the one with the oldest associations and the clubs that dated back far enough to feel like geography rather than ambition. East Hampton was slightly more artistic, slightly more permissive, slightly more likely to have a painter at the dinner table who said something interesting and unsettling. You drove out on Friday afternoons in traffic that was already becoming legendary, and you returned Monday mornings, and you did this every single weekend from Memorial Day to Labor Day, and you complained about it the entire time while also never once considering not going. The house was opened in late May by whoever opened houses, the caretaker, the housekeeper who travelled out ahead, some combination of people whose job it was to transform a closed, dusty, winter-sealed building back into something habitable over the course of a few days. Slip covers came off, windows were opened, the refrigerator was stocked, the outdoor furniture was carried from wherever it had been stored and arranged on the lawn or the porch with the practiced placement of people who had done it many times and knew where things went. By the time you arrived on the first real weekend, the house looked as though it had been waiting for you, which it had, in a way, been made to look, which is not quite the same thing, but is close enough that the distinction didn't trouble you. Southampton in the 1960s had a social structure as organised and as legible as anything in the city. The Bathing Corporation, the Meadow Club, the Shinnecock Hills Golf Club, these institutions organised the summer the way the city's clubs organised the rest of the year, by who was in and who was not, by the particular calibration of membership that communicated standing in the shorthand that everyone who needed to read it could read. The beach at the Bathing Corporation was private, which meant it was populated by the same people you saw at dinner in the city, now wearing less and carrying towels, but otherwise operating on the same social frequencies. You rented a cabana if you had the right tenure. You knew whose umbrella was whose without labels. The social obligation followed you from the city and in some ways intensified, because in the Hamptons the geography was more concentrated. You couldn't simply not go somewhere or claim a prior engagement when the prior engagement was also there, also in Southampton, also with access to the same 40 square miles of social theatre. You saw everyone, constantly, in the way that resort communities compress the social world into a proximity that the city, with its size and its different neighbourhoods and its ability to absorb avoidance, does not. If you had a quarrel with someone, you would see them at the club on Saturday. If you were tired of someone, you would see them at the dinner on Sunday. If you were falling in love with someone you shouldn't be falling in love with, you would see them everywhere, which was either wonderful or catastrophic depending on the week. The children ran looser in the summers, which was one of the genuine and uncomplicated goods of the arrangement. They spent mornings at the beach and afternoons doing whatever the particular summer had organised for children at that age. Sailing lessons at the yacht club, tennis at the courts, the company of other children from the same world who would be, for the rest of their lives, the people they called when they needed someone who understood without explanation where they had come from. These friendships, formed on Southampton beaches in the 1960s summers, were some of the most durable connections in a world that prized duration. They survived marriages and divorces and financial reversals and the general dispersal of adult life because they predated all of it. By Labour Day, the house was closed again. The furniture went back into storage. The windows went back into their frames. The caretaker did his final walk-through. You drove back to the city with a particular feeling of a season completed, not quite sad, not quite relieved, carrying the slight tiredness of 3 months of compulsory pleasure and the knowledge that in 8 months you would do it all again, which was both slightly exhausting and, in its way, something you were already quietly looking forward to. Between approximately 6 and 8 o'clock every evening in a certain stratum of New York society, a ritual occurred that had the shape of relaxation but the function of social management. The cocktail hour. Drinks were made properly by someone who knew how to make them, not poured from a bottle on a kitchen counter, but assembled at a bar cart with the gravity of a small pharmaceutical operation. The shaker was silver. The glasses were crystal. Ice was not an afterthought. Guests arrived knowing that this was not a time for honesty or urgency. It was a time for warmth and wit, and the particular performance of ease that said, "This is who we are, this is how we live, and you are welcome here as long as you play your part convincingly." The bar cart was a piece of furniture with genuine social importance, positioned in the drawing room with the same intentionality as the sofa and the painting above the fireplace. It held the bottles, whiskey and gin and vodka and vermouth, alongside the tools, the silver shaker, the strainer, the long-handled spoon for stirring, the small cutting board for the lemon peel. It was tended by the husband in most households, because making the drinks was one of the few domestic acts that fell within the masculine role without requiring explanation, and it was done with a certain performative competence that communicated ease and mastery simultaneously. He knew how you took your drink. He knew how the guests took theirs. The martini was made properly, which in this world had a definition that was non-negotiable, and which you would have been able to articulate if asked, though you were rarely asked because the people around you already agreed on what properly meant. The drink itself was secondary to what the cocktail hour produced socially, which was the particular loosening that made the subsequent dinner or evening function at a higher level of frankness than it would have otherwise. Not drunk, no one was drunk, that was not the point, but softened at the edges, the defensive architecture of the day slightly lowered, the performance of composure slightly relaxed. People said things at cocktails that they would not have said earlier in the day and that they would not say again later at the dinner table where the formality reasserted itself. The cocktail hour was the hinge between the day's persona and the evening's, and it did its work in the space of 90 minutes with the reliable efficiency of something that had been doing this work for decades. There were rules, unwritten and universally observed. You did not arrive more than 15 minutes late to cocktails without a reason. You did not bring up anything genuinely unpleasant during cocktails, serious illness, serious money problems, anything that required the full cognitive engagement of people who were trying to make a gentle transition into the evening. You did not refuse a drink without offering a reason that your host could accept, because refusal without explanation created a small social turbulence that was disproportionate to the act. You kept the conversation moving, and light, and funny if possible, and interesting if not. You did not corner anyone for longer than the natural arc of a cocktail conversation, which was approximately 8 to 12 minutes, after which a graceful extraction was both permitted and expected. In houses where cocktail hour happened every evening regardless of guests, as it did in many of the households we are talking about, as a daily rhythm rather than an occasional event, it served an additional function as a daily decompression chamber, the 30 or 40 minutes between the day's obligations and the evenings, between the office or the committees and the dinner table and whatever the night held. The husband arrived. The drink was made. They sat. They talked, or they didn't, depending on the day. The apartment was quiet except for the sounds of dinner being prepared in the kitchen at the far end. The light changed outside the windows. The city moved through its evening. And for the duration of one careful drink in a crystal glass, the day was held at arm's length and the evening had not yet begun. The wardrobe of a wealthy New York woman in the 1960s was a significant capital investment managed with the seriousness of a portfolio. Twice a year, Paris sent its instructions. The collections filtered through to department stores and private seamstresses, and the pages of Vogue, which was read less as a magazine and more as a briefing document, and adjustments were made accordingly. Hemlines shifted, colours changed, the silhouette evolved and the wardrobe evolved with it, because being caught in last season's shape was a specific kind of failure that people noticed. The husband's wardrobe required less maintenance but no less precision. The bespoke suits from the same tailor his father had used, the shirts monogrammed, the shoes kept in cedar trees and polished weekly whether or not they had been worn. The closet was organised with the rigour of a filing system because it functioned as one. Day clothes here, evening clothes there, the in-between category of smart daytime or early evening, the category requiring the most judgment, the category where mistakes were most likely, because the other two had clearer rules. Everything was kept in protective bags or on proper hangers, space to breathe, because fabric that was crushed did not recover quickly, and dry cleaning was not an emergency service even when you needed it to be. Shoes were stored in their original boxes with photographs on the front so that the right pair could be located without excavation. Bags were stuffed to hold their shape. The organisation was the lady's maid's domain, maintained according to a system that had evolved over years, and which the woman herself navigated with the ease of someone who lives in a well-run environment without having directly created it. The twice-yearly process of wardrobe revision was a significant undertaking. What from last year still worked, what had dated irretrievably, what needed to be altered, hemlines raised, taken in here, let out there, the body being the variable to which the clothes were adapted rather than the reverse. The alteration service at the department store or the private dressmaker on the East 70s was a relationship of long standing. The woman who knew your measurements without checking them, who understood your body's particular geometry, who could look at a garment and see in 30 seconds what needed to happen to make it right. This relationship lasted decades. When it ended through retirement or death, it required replacement with the seriousness of replacing any professional whose knowledge was irreplaceable. The budget for this was substantial and was not itemised. It existed in the household accounts as a category, clothing, and beneath that, cleaning and alterations and storage, and below that, accessories, which was its own significant subcategory, and the numbers in this category were reviewed by the husband with the generalised acceptance of a man who understood that his wife's appearance was a form of household presentation and therefore a legitimate household expense, even when he occasionally experienced a private reaction to the numbers that he managed to not express. This management was its own small domestic skill set, practised on both sides. What the wardrobe produced at its best was the illusion that the woman wearing it had simply always appeared this way, that the presentation was natural, constitutional, a matter of inherent taste rather than accumulated investment and sustained effort. This was the supreme achievement of the whole enterprise, to look in the right dress at the right event, as though you could not have looked any other way, as though the Givenchy was the most obvious thing in the room, as though it had cost nothing, which was the most expensive thing it could possibly have looked like. Owning a country house meant, by the unwritten codes of the era, hosting people in it. This was not a choice so much as a consequence of having it, the way owning a boat meant eventually taking people on it, even when you would have preferred to be alone. The guest list was assembled with care, the right combination of people who would entertain each other, who would not require managing, who were good at the particular rhythms of a country weekend, late breakfasts, a walk or a game of tennis, lunch that stretched pleasantly into the afternoon, drinks at 6, dinner that went until people remembered themselves. Guests who were too demanding were not invited back. Guests who were dull were not invited back either. The ideal guest in the 1960s country house was someone who somehow managed to seem grateful without seeming needy, and entertaining without seeming to try. The invitation itself was issued with a specificity that communicated the terms clearly. Friday evening through Sunday afternoon, or Saturday morning through Sunday after lunch. The duration was stated gently but unmistakably, because guests who arrived early or stayed late disrupted the infrastructure of the household in ways that accumulated faster than the inconvenience they cost, and the infrastructure of a country house weekend was more delicate than it appeared. The cook needed to know numbers for every meal. The bedrooms needed to be prepared. The towels needed to be fresh, and the flowers in the guest rooms needed to be cut that morning, and if you arrived a day early, none of this was ready, and the whole thing announced itself as the production it was, which was the one thing it absolutely could not be seen to be. The guest room was attended to with care that bordered on theatrical. Fresh flowers on the dresser, cut from the garden, always, because cut flowers from a florist in a country house garden were a visible inconsistency. Good towels, thick ones, in a colour that coordinated with the bathroom rather than clashing with it. A carafe of water on the nightstand and something to read. A novel chosen with some thought for what this particular guest might enjoy. Not just whatever was lying around, because the what's lying around was also, in this context, a choice. A window with a view, if the house's geometry permitted. Hangers in the wardrobe. These details were assembled by someone, and their assembly was invisible, which was the only acceptable way for them to exist. The rhythm of the weekend had a natural arc that the good host managed with a light touch. Friday evening, arrival drinks, dinner, relatively informal, getting everyone settled. Saturday, the most active day. Breakfast late, tennis or a walk or the beach. Lunch that was outdoor if the weather cooperated. The afternoon loosely organised around individual preference. Drinks at 6 with precision. Dinner with some ceremony. Sunday, the gentler day. Late breakfast. The newspapers. The gradual unhurried approach to departure. The mistake was over-planning Saturday to the point where people felt scheduled, which was the opposite of what a country weekend was supposed to produce. Guests were expected to navigate the visit with a certain social competence, to find their own entertainment during the loose periods without requiring direction, to participate in the group activities without dominating them, to be interesting at meals without monopolizing the conversation, to help themselves to things that were made available while never touching things that weren't, and to depart at the stated time with warmth and a handwritten note sent within 48 hours. The thank you note was mandatory. Its absence was noticed and recorded in the silent ledger that hostesses kept, and occasionally compared with each other over lunch, not vindictively, simply as a matter of accounting. You knew who sent notes and who didn't. After a while, you invited accordingly. The evening did not end at 11. It relocated. After dinner, the party might continue at El Morocco, the nightclub that had been the centre of after-dark society since the 30s and retained enough of its original glamour to still be relevant, though its relevance was being debated, as relevance always was. Or there was the Stork Club, in its final years still trying. Or someone went somewhere new, somewhere downtown, somewhere a little louder and a little more uncertain, because the 1960s were doing something to the edges of everything, loosening them, letting in a different kind of energy, and even the firmly planted members of the old social order occasionally found themselves somewhere unexpected, surrounded by people they couldn't immediately place, and feeling, briefly, slightly alive in a new way. El Morocco had opened in 1931 and had survived on the strength of its zebra print banquettes and its celebrity clientele and its door policy, which was managed with the implacable authority of someone who understood that the value of the room was entirely dependent on who was allowed into it. The zebra print was absurd and iconic simultaneously, which was the only register in which nightclub decor of this era could succeed. The lighting was designed to flatter, which meant it was low, which meant the room had a particular intimacy that the participants used in different ways depending on what they were there for. Some were there to be seen, which required a certain calculated positioning within the room. Some were there to dance, which El Morocco permitted with elegance in a way that most of its competitors did not quite manage. Some were there because the evening had gone well and needed to continue somewhere that matched its momentum. The Stork Club was older and more frayed by the 1960s, the era having moved somewhat past the particular frequency it operated on, though it retained its devotees and its corner booth mythology and the sense that history had been made here and might, tonight, be made again. Sherman Billingsley, who had run it for decades, was a figure from an earlier chapter of the social story, and the club wore the quality of a place that had once been the centre and was now slightly adjacent to the centre, which was a melancholy state that the room's lighting did its best to obscure. It was still worth going. It was just no longer the only place worth going, which was not a condition it had been designed to accept. The newer places were a different proposition entirely. Downtown, in neighbourhoods that serious uptown money had not previously entered except by accident, things were happening in the early 60s that would by the end of the decade have entirely reorganised the cultural geography of the city. The artists and the writers and the musicians and the people who followed them had created their own world at the margins of the one we have been describing, and that world was beginning to exert a gravitational pull on the younger members of the old social order, the children who are now in their 20s, the ones who had grown up in the Park Avenue apartments and gone to the right schools and were now going somewhere else, something louder, in a borrowed jacket instead of a bespoke one. Some of the older generation went too, occasionally with the slightly widened eyes of tourists, in a place they recognised as significant without entirely understanding it. They returned uptown afterward and described what they had seen to people who had not gone, with a mixture of amusement and something harder to name. Not quite envy, but an awareness that a different version of the evening was available, a version that didn't require a seating chart or a thank you note or the correct dress or the management of anyone's feelings. Just noise and company and the freedom of a room where nobody knew exactly who you were, which was a freedom that money, somewhat paradoxically, made very hard to come by. In a world where everyone knew everyone, information moved with startling speed and remarkable accuracy, even when it was not entirely accurate. The gossip networks of 1960s New York high society were maintained through a series of overlapping communication channels. The telephone calls between women in the morning while the help was working, the conversations at the hairdresser, the exchanges at charity committee meetings, the murmured asides at cocktail parties when someone left the room. What had happened? Who had been seen where? With whom? What the financial situation was understood to be. Whether the marriage was as solid as it appeared, all of this circulated continuously, was updated, refined, corrected, embellished, and circulated again. Knowing something first was a form of prestige. Knowing something and choosing not to share it was a form of power. The telephone was the primary instrument. In the mornings between 9 and noon, the network activated. Calls were made and received with a frequency that would have seemed excessive if anyone had calculated it, which no one did because it was simply part of the morning. These were not idle conversations, or they were not only idle. They were the mechanism by which the social world processed the previous evening, assigned meaning to what had been observed, and prepared for what was coming. Who had seemed strained at dinner? Who had arrived separately and left together? Who had drunk too much, said too much, worn something that was either wonderful or a mistake, depending on your position in the conversation. All of this was discussed with the analytical rigour of people who took the data seriously, because the data was serious, and because understanding it correctly had practical consequences. The hairdresser occupied a special position in the information economy. 2 or 3 mornings a week, the women of a certain stratum of New York society sat in chairs at the right salons on Madison and Park, Kenneth's, above all others, where Jackie Kennedy went and where going carried its own credential, and submitted to the weekly ritual of maintenance while talking to each other in adjacent chairs or talking to the hairdresser himself, who was in many cases one of the best informed people in the city. He heard everything from everyone, offered nothing, remembered it all, and occasionally redirected a conversation that was becoming too specific in ways that might cause someone present difficulty. He was, in his way, an information broker of considerable sophistication, and his discretion was the foundation of his business, as much as his technical skill with hair. The information that circulated was not uniformly malicious, which is worth noting. Some of it was simply news. Someone was pregnant, someone was moving, someone's child had gotten into the right school or hadn't, which was information that affected social calculations and required updating. Some of it was genuinely warm, concern about a friend who seemed unwell, attention to a marriage that seemed troubled, the collective solidarity of women who had been watching each other's lives for years and who cared, in their complicated way, about what happened in them. The line between concern and surveillance was not always clear, and most people on both sides of it preferred to leave it blurry. What the gossip network ultimately maintained was the coherence of the world it described. By continuously processing information about its members, their standings, their situations, their recent behaviour and likely next moves, the network kept the social map current. It knew who was up and who was down, who was in and who was falling out, who needed to be managed gently, and who could be trusted with something sensitive. This knowledge was the nervous system of the social body. Without it, the dinner parties and the charity galas and the club memberships would have been a collection of individual events rather than a continuous living structure. The gossip was not the corruption of the world. It was, in a very real sense, how the world worked. So tonight, you've spent an evening somewhere, Very few people ever actually lived, but somewhere all of us, in some quiet corner of our imagination, have at least briefly visited. You wandered through the penthouse with its 14 rooms and its 4 used ones. You sat in the back of the black car while the driver said nothing and knew everything. You stood at the bar cart with a silver shaker and a crystal glass, and the particular performance of ease that took years to learn and never quite became real. You ate 7 courses at a table set 3 days in advance. You smiled at someone you didn't especially like because the social calendar required it, and you did it well, because doing it well was the only acceptable option, and if some of it glittered, some of it also ached. The wife who ran everything and was credited for nothing. The children raised by everyone and fully known by no one. The marriages performing their stability long after the stability had quietly departed. The doctor who kept the machine running and never asked why it needed so much keeping. The man standing at his office window at 4 p.m, briefcase in hand, not entirely sure what he'd been doing there all day or why. The woman at the penthouse window at night looking out at the park with everything she had ever been told to want, wondering why wanting had not turned out to be the same thing as having. Because this is what history keeps showing us, in every era and every tax bracket, that the arrangements we build to make ourselves safe and comfortable and significant are more fragile than they appear from the outside, and more complicated on the inside than anyone who has not lived inside them can know. The filthy rich of 1960s New York were not villains. They were people, shaped by their world the way all people are shaped by theirs, doing what their world had taught them to do, paying the cost their world charged, and carrying, most of them, some private version of the same questions the rest of us carry about whether we are living correctly and whether any of it is enough. They are mostly gone now, those particular people in those particular apartments. The buildings are still there. The clubs, some of them, are still there. The Hamptons are still there, though they would barely recognise themselves. What remains, mostly, is the story, the shape of a world that existed for a while, in a specific place, at a specific moment, before the city changed, and the decade changed, and the children came home from college, and the certainty began to soften at the edges. Tonight, wherever you are in your apartment that is not a penthouse, with your coffee that appeared without ceremony, without a pressed newspaper and a cook who memorized your preferences, you are, in the ways that matter most, doing just fine. You have warmth. You have rest. You have the freedom to fall asleep without performing anything for anyone, which is, when you think about it, its own kind of wealth. The quiet kind. The kind money could never entirely purchase, no matter how many rooms it rented. Sleep well.